Hey everybody, welcome. Just wanted to give a follow-up to the first session for those of you who missed, and also provide a bit of a record, kind of thematic overview, expectation setting for those of you who might be interested in the future in this kind of unique approach to preparing for dark retreat, which we're calling the primordial spaces of the body. So in general, I'm just kind of situating this approach within the traditions of Mahamudra and Mahasandhi, the Great Perfection, where we understand that the path is not about arriving somewhere or achieving something or producing something, creating through causes some sort of result, but rather coming back to what is already present, that which is innate or connate, sometimes said, that which is ever present and always. And so the process or the path, therefore, is characterized by a shedding, a letting go, a dropping down. And so this theme of what's called in Tibetan Rongbap is kind of the most important aspect of all of that which we're going to be looking at. Rongbap meaning naturally settled. Rong means self, bap means to fall. So this aspect of really settling into what is already there, that which is innate. And sort of following on that, to set the tone, really want to encourage everyone to develop confidence in your own sufficiency, so to speak, that you already have what you need. Some people ask, is dark retreat right for me? Apprehensions about it, wondering about the methods, do I want to add more practice to what I'm already doing, all of that kind of thing. It's not really about that. It's that we have yet another opportunity to relax back into, develop a sense of sufficiency of that which we already are, which is whole. And so that's the kind of starting premise, the foundational assumption. We already have what we need. And on the deepest level, that is our Buddha nature. That is the inseparability, the aspect of wholeness and completeness. That is the nature of our mind, which we know on some level. And following from that, whatever we do after that is playful, is exploratory, is a process of discovery or rediscovery, rather than something that demands particular effort or perfecting a technique or getting it right versus getting it wrong and so forth. So really encouraging that kind of playful, exploratory, and also in some cases creative, innovative, and developing that sense of playful creativity is really important in terms of the methods and the way that we go about this. And that very much leading to a sense of community, that we are doing this together, that we're doing this in dialogue, that we are also doing this in relationship with the world, that this relational component is really where the rubber meets the road and is the fruit of what we're trying to uncover, familiarize ourselves with, and so forth. That it really is about love in community and that being in the world. And so, again, just setting the kind of context and tone for this exploration. So when we talk about dark retreat, there's so many different traditions around the world. And Andrew Holacek, who will be speaking later in this course, is really a master and of giving voice to the dark, and also weaving all of these disparate anthropological, historical, mythological threads together. But in my own case, just being able to speak from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition, want to highlight a few different variants of what constitutes dark retreat. And the first is probably what most people associate with dark retreat, and is why there is some degree of hesitancy in approaching it or thinking to practice it, because this stream of dark retreat is actually not only the most kind of demanding, but also the most tightly held in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So oftentimes it's called Yanti or Yanti Nakpo, which is a subset of many different dimensions of what is called Togyal practice in the Great Perfection tradition. And so we're not going to be practicing Yanti, but it very much does inform the approach, and at the end especially be pointing people to living masters of that tradition, so that you can, if you're inspired to, go in that tradition. In my own case, the Yanti teachings that I've received come from Chojel Namkai Norbu Rinpoche, who himself, in part received a lot of those transmissions in visions through dreams with Tungso Repa, and also in part through human-to-human transmission. And one of the most important sources of that was through Ayu Khandro, and I'll talk about her later. So that's the first Yanti, and this is the more visionary aspect. It has to do with oftentimes the Bardo teachings. Has to do with visionary experience and integrating that as a natural quality, the self-perfection of the natural state of mind. So again, that will be in the background, but we're not going to be going there particularly. Another aspect is using dark retreat. It's kind of like anti-using. It's more just go in there and see what happens. Fuck around and find out, almost. You just show up and you don't do anything. You just arrive. And you might explore this or that, but there's no real instruction except to see what happens. And if there is any instruction, it's really, again, rangbap. And this is the way that I was trained, particularly initially in darkness practice. Just let go again and again, and we'll get into this more in a minute, but just a process of unfolding, divesting, relaxing, settling. So anti-method, no instruction, just showing up and seeing what happens. And then the third is really much more related with tantric methods, subtle body visualizations, subtle body yogas. And in conversation with my friend David Germano, who will be speaking later in this course, we were talking about this element, and he was saying how it's interesting that when you go in the dark, or just actually in any case, the interior of the body is opaque. It's not something that you can actually see into. Of course, you can cut open the body and see that, but that's still the exterior of something that is interior. So this interior dimension. And of course we have interoception, we have ways of feeling into the interior of the body. But in the dark, this is what comes out most saliently. And at the same time, the outside of the body is also opaque. And so there's this kind of problematization of the interior versus the exterior and kind of placing them on the same level. And at the same time, then you practice techniques of visualization of the subtle body, different matrices, different aspects of the channels, the chakras, deities, inner fire, all the different types of inner yogas. And in that environment, therefore, because there is no longer an inner or an outer, there is only the other, in the sense of Kala Chakra. There is only this kind of sacred dimension of subtle body dynamics. And so it's a very potent context or backdrop to do that kind of inner yoga work. And we will be doing some of that, and not particularly extensive, but that we'll be touching on that in some ways. So those are the three main ways that the tradition has approached darkness practice. And then there is what is happening more in contemporary times, where dark retreat is becoming, in some cases, a wellness trend, a way of resetting. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. It's just a way for people to rest, basically, to more deeply rest, and also to explore aspects of themselves that otherwise might be hidden. So really being able to look more deeply into, who am I, what is this life, this world, and so forth. And there's a lot of overlap with psychotherapeutic approaches, and there's a lot of overlap with aspects of somatic psychotherapy as well. And so I'll talk about how that all interfaces in a minute. So those are the main kind of dimensions of what how darkness practice is being done, at least in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and in contemporary contexts in secular aspects. And I also wanted to talk a little bit more about where I'm coming from, not only from those particular dimensions, but in my own training. And so there's really two kind of main divisions. One is, again, more contemporary, and another modern, so to speak, and another is the more traditional context. So in the modern context, there's a lot of, again, overlap between practicing body-based meditation and psychotherapy, and some of the main people that I've trained with and really draw inspiration from are, first of all, Reggie Ray, who at a certain point authorized me to teach his somatic protocols. Also John Wellwood. I've never met John Wellwood, but really benefited from all of his writings and audio, visual, all the things that he produced over the years. So important for being able to bridge the worlds of psychology and Buddhism, especially embodied nature of mind teachings. And one of his main teachers was Tsoknyi Rinpoche. So I also want to name him and acknowledge my connection with him as well, in the really important ways that he has been able to both acknowledge and also incorporate nature of mind teachings with the body, and the importance of the body, and the warmth of the body, and the love of the body, and all of that. So that's really important to mention. Also, Peter Levine, Eugene Genlin, the more body-based psychotherapeutic approaches, and then also my time with Lama Deni Rinpoche, who has developed a number of translations of Dzogchen Mahamudra teachings into more contemporary contexts, and the primacy of the body being one of the main things that I took away from that. So there's that. And then in the more traditional context, it's always a question of how far back you want to go when you trace sources. But just kind of to stop midway along the way, I think the main place that I take inspiration from is this Rime movement time at the end of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, rather, early 1900s. And in the middle of that, particularly singling out two luminaries. Again, if you're not familiar with them, and if it's inspiring to you, really encourage you to check out the biographies, the stories of Jaman Kongtrul Lodro Tai, and his teacher and student and compatriot, Jamyam Chense Wangpo. And so this is really where it all starts for me in particular, and how all of the different lineages that I practice in, and I have practiced in, can trace themselves back to that time and that movement and that friendship, that relationship, really. And so, just to name that, my own teacher, Lama Norla Rinpoche, studying with Kala Rinpoche, who is the direct incarnation of Jaman Kongtrul Lodro Tai. And then Taisita Rinpoche, also in the middle of that milieu. And then also, of course, Chense Rinpoche, Zonsa Khyentse Rinpoche, who is the incarnation of Jamin Chense Chogi Lodro, who again comes back to Khyentse Wangpo. And also Choja Namkhay Norbu, who I mentioned already, he being the incarnation of the students of Jamin Chense Wangpo, and he's studying also again with Ayu Khandro, who is a direct student again of Jamyang Chenseng Wangpo. So during Namkhai Norbu, as he had many incarnation streams, but one of them was as Ajahn Drukpa, who is a direct student of Chenseng Wangpo as well. So I know for many of you, these are all just Tibetan names and so forth, and so you could just treat this as an invocation of blessing. But I know also for some of you it's very important, and you like to know where all this is coming from. So for me, it's always fun to talk about family trees, I guess you could say. So anyway, so that's where all of this is coming from, and I think we could kind of shift gears now and just talk about the specifics. There's really three main domains that I want to get into with the approach of this particular course. The first is darkness itself. The second is the body. And the third is this aspect of the divine feminine, and how all of these are really kind of a braid that are woven together in the dark, so to speak. So this first aspect of the darkness itself, as I began with Rungbop, naturally settling. And there's really a few different dimensions of this that we've already touched on. The first is basically self-regulation. There's so many people going into the dark because it's so it gives permission to relax in a way. It's like it's such almost like a womb. Andrew always says a womb with a view. Anyway, so it's like a place of recovery, a place of self-regulation. It gives us a chance to unplug, as any retreat might, but on a much deeper level. It gives even the cells of our body a chance to stop being irradiated, basically. All of the ways in which we are locked into light and stimulation and speed and all of that. All of this is, you can read about this in any tricycle article and so forth. This is a basic situation in which we find ourselves as modern individuals, and darkness offers a respite. And so there is something really important about that dimension. You can just go in and sleep as much as you want. And then at a certain point, you can't sleep anymore, and we kind of shift gears. But at that point, generally, for most of the people who are trying dark retreat for the first time, 2-3 days, something like that, generally it's a really good opportunity to rest and reset. Yeah. And that's, again, an aspect of Rungbop. Just let it all drop, let it fall, and fully arrive. So now that you've fully arrived, then you say, wait a second, who am I? What is this? Maybe I can take off the mask. And part of the release of efforting, all of the investment, is having a safe space to be naked, just to take off the armor, to let down the guard. And again, that kind of womb-like quality of being held, that just as in any psychotherapeutic relationship, there is that alliance, there is that holding container, as Winnicott said, that capacity to be nurtured and to not be judged, a space that is completely non-judgmental. It's just a mirror, in the same sense that a mirror doesn't judge what it's reflecting. That space offers us a chance to actually look at ourselves and know thyself, and there's a lot to say about that. But this aspect of self-understanding is so important in the context of Rungbop. Let's just fall into who we actually are instead of who we are pretending to be. And so in that dimension, then being in the dark is potentially challenging relative to the degree to which we've been living a lie. Because now the lie is exposed, not by someone else who then can blame us, but by our own awareness, our own non-judgmental awareness. And that opens up an extremely tender place of self-acceptance, potentially, of acknowledgement, of healing, of the capacity to show up for ourselves in ways that we hadn't been able to before. We're able to actually develop attunement to ourselves, which then can heal attachment wounds, lack of attunement in various other ways. So that whole dimension of Rongbab, super important. The last one then, after sort of uncovering the masks, then we can look deeply into who we truly are beyond, this biography, beyond this life narrative, beyond the details of who we are, whether those are deceptive or genuine. What is essentially true? Who are we, irrespective of whether we're alive or dead? Right? And so now we move into much deeper waters, and at this point then the practice becomes nature of mind, right? And so at this point, we really fall into, again, this Rongbap, a state of complete relaxation, which is, as Namkhai Nobre Rinpoche talks about Chekcho, or cutting through to the nature of mind. He just calls it total relaxation. So if we are able to relax on that level and mix space, inner space, outer space, mind space, great space, what is known? What is revealed? And again, the premise is this is nature of mind. What happens when we can move from all of the contents of our experience, all of the things that are beeping, flashing, moving, doing, to the context? What is the backdrop of all of this? What is the light that is projecting all of these lights, so to speak? What is there, as I said a moment ago, what is there that is continuous, whether we are alive, dying, or dead? The dark teaches us this. This is the lesson that we can learn in the dark. And so, preparing for death is one of the most important benefits of darkness practice. And it is really not only in the psychotherapeutic sense, but also a cultural sense. Darkness is the shadow, right, for everything that's happening. But in the shadow, when we really truly look with insight, with higher seeing into the shadow, we find fullness and truth. Right? So we could go on, and I, after this point, I'm not going to talk nearly as much about all of this, but the darkness is a very rich mythological, poetic, psychological matrix of meaning, and there's a lot to say about that. But you can already intuit the second aspect of the body. So much of what I just mentioned about the dark is really basically equivalent to what can be said about the body, the space of the body, especially in the sense of the shadow. There's a lot of psychotherapeutic modalities that talk about the body as the unconscious. The body is the unconscious. I think Jung made that assertion, just flat out, right? And in the dark, what's interesting is that because there isn't the normal stimulation through the eyes and ideally the ears, and in many cases you are motionless, so the proprioceptive sense shuts down, tactile sense, sense of smell, generally when things aren't moving around, that dies down, and so all you're left with is the body and mentation. And so these two really turn on, much more so. And the stream of conceptuality goes into overdrive in many cases, or you kind of alternate with passing out. And the body sense especially turns on. And for anyone who's done, one of the Burmese style Vipassana retreats where you do body scanning for 9 hours a day for 9 days or whatever, 10 days. You know what that's like to churn the soma, to kind of comb the soma, to unfold and continually almost like purge the soma. Everything that is held in the body is allowed the theater to express itself. So a lot of darkness practice is that level of revealing, listening to, and bearing witness to what the body is holding. And again, there's so much to say about the internal logic and dynamics of somatic meditation practice and somatic therapy. But on the most kind of essential level, the premise is that cognitive grasping to, on the deepest level, reality, self and world, that duality is held in the body. And then secondary, tertiary, all of the derivative layers of grasping rest on that foundation. And whatever type of, therefore, stress that we have just by being alive, doing what we're doing, is inscribed and held in the body. Whatever kind of trauma that we have been witness to is held and inscribed in the body. And if that isn't shaken out, it remains there until, in some cases, the time we die, or until, in some cases, we deliberately go into the body to explore it, or randomly coming out in various ways, and various illnesses and so forth. But the idea here is that we're going to deliberately go in and explore the patterns of grasping, the patterns of holding in the body, and thereby, again, first of all, give ourselves a chance to rest, a space of non-judgmental presence, but then actually unraveling and unfolding that which is being held. Not in any particularly autobiographical sense, necessarily, but on a somatic level, which is non-conceptual, which is immediate, and which is trustworthy. So again, a lot to say about the somatic approach, but this thread of Rangbap, of naturally settling, is really what we follow in that process. Just with sustained, loving attention, let the body tell its story and unfold as it will in its own time. The dark provides the space for that. So that's more on the kind of personal, relative level. But then in the middle of all of that, and also as a kind of point of arrival after we've processed to some degree this kind of strata of our identity, moving from kind of gross fictional self to these underlying layers of ingrained, inscribed patterning, to something that is just core woundedness, the core rawness, the core vulnerability of being a self that is known by the body. When we arrive at that level, and we can start to touch that and start to be able to remain there in that, which in many cases seems like the place that is the worst place to be, the thing to avoid at all costs, the thing that if you were to feel it fully would mean annihilation. These kind of associations that we have created by merely existing and coming into being as an ego, at the root of it is this aspect of core wounding. And when we're able to, again, remain with that and look into it and be curious about it, have that attitude of creativity, exploration, playfulness, even in the middle of that, sitting on the lotus of pains, as Tagore says, being able to remain in that, then there is a doorway that opens up. And when we are able to look through that doorway, there is revelation, there is gnosis, there is, after the catharsis, the capacity to know in a higher way, insight, vipassana, right? Higher seeing, higher insight. And so this is the main focus of the course, that bridge between the personal and the primordial, and how they're there together. And we're going to be looking at that in 3 different domains. First, in the heart space. How are we holding in the heart? How has our story been written in that space and has resulted in that space being occluded or obscured in various ways by all the ways that we have grasped, clung, shut down, and so forth? And what is the unique disclosure on the far side of that when we look into the heart space? And looking at how that has touch points with clear light yoga, with aspects of dissolution and union, process of dying, and so forth. So there's a lot to discover there. Second space is that of the belly. Again, how have we stuffed whatever it is that we don't want to deal with or weren't able to deal with into that space? How is that space holding in a unique way our story? And then when we're able to remain there and look into that, what is the unique matrix of mystery, the womb of emptiness? What is that space when we look deeply? And what might we discover in that space? And then the third is headspace. Same thing, kind of central headquarters. What happens, how are we basically identified with that way of being through thought, through representation, through conceptuality? What is our tendency to jump into that space? And actually, it's not even that space, it's a simulation of that space. What happens when we look at the head as a space rather than as an abstract exit point? When we look into the headspace and we start to unfold that and start to dethrone, the supremacy of the rational mind, to take away that authority and to see that space as a unique space in its own right, a primordial space. What is that like to look into that? And then what do we find? And what type of insight is thereby disclosed? What opens? So also very unique. And in the space of the belly, we'll also be looking at aspects of Sukha Siddhi, which is, in the longer dark retreats I did, were integration practices of the clear light yoga in the 6 yogas of Sukha Siddhi. In the space of the heart, we'll be looking at Prajnaparamita, perfection of wisdom. And in the space of the head, we'll also be looking at another practice from the yogas of Niguma that is done in the yogas of Sukha Siddhi as well. So there'll be some traditional dimensions to this. And that kind of segues into the last aspect here of the divine feminine, where all of these spaces can be known and can show up with a face, with a voice, as something we can dialogue with. And this is such a unique quality of Tantra, that wisdom is something that is personified. The body, the spaces of the body, everything basically is personified in Tantra. And that not only lends a very personal dimension to it, it also lends a mythological potency. And it also allows us to not only to trust, but to go deeper into that dialogue and be guided, to really be able to have a relationship with wisdom. Is so important. So that's something that I think is also a really essential aspect of the approach here. And there's so many. I know so many people in this current course are practitioners, devotees of aspects of the divine feminine, and particularly the dark feminine. When we look at the Black Madonna, aspects of Kali, I know many of you are practitioners of trauma, of Krodikali, Kanrasangdu. So there's so much overlay of these different traditions historically with darkness practice. As I mentioned before, Ayu Khandro, the first thing that she did when she met Namkhai Norma Rinpoche, she was in dark retreat for, she lived to be like 120, I think, and she was in dark retreat for the last, 60 years of her life or so. And she didn't really have any visitors, but Namkhai Norma came to visit. He was told to pursue some Vajrayogini teachings with her, and she refused to teach him anything. She was very cordial and so forth. But after she had a dream of her teacher, Jamyang Sensei Wangpo, and she was instructed to give him the teachings on Kandrasangdu, Krodikali, she herself being an embodiment of that. And so there's in so many different examples, this intersection of the divine feminine with the divine wrathful feminine, the dark feminine, with the space of darkness and dark retreat. But in any case, I know so many of you are familiar with those practices, but we're not going to necessarily be specific about it. And I want to reserve that space as a space of mystery, the unknown. And so thereby allowing it to show up in whatever way is appropriate for you, creating an invitation, an open space for that to show up in whatever way it might, right? And instead to leaving that undefined, and instead to define the space around it, to create a critique of everything that is not the divine feminine and this aspect of the dark, wrathful feminine. So the wrathful this is something that Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche talks about. The wrathful is, you can characterize it in different ways, but fundamentally it's just what is not familiar. It is, in this case, totally unfamiliar. What is most unfamiliar? What is the least bit familiar? That which we can't see, we can't know, we can't get any handle on. There are no edges, there are no corners, there's no details, there's nothing to say about it. It's just totally unfamiliar. For some reason, that is an aspect of wrathful method. And so when we go into the dark, it's very much like that, and therefore it cuts through everything that is not that. And so when we're defining that space around the divine feminine, it's basically all of the nonsense that the wrathful method is cutting through, peeling away, divesting, allowing us to purge, to, divest ourselves of. And so I've been reading a lot of bell hooks lately, and I love the way that she approaches this, which is through the lens of patriarchy. Now, she has a whole kind of complex of the way that patriarchy interrelates with racism and capitalism and so forth. But specifically with respect to patriarchy, she defines this whole thing as all of the attempts that we make, that we are conditioned, that we've adopted into making, messages from outside and internalized messages that we have to avoid and to shield ourselves from vulnerability, which is the basis of intimacy, which is love. So everything that the divine feminine is cutting through is, on the most essential level, that which is obscuring or foiling or disconnecting us from love, from intimacy, from vulnerability. And so as we go forward, having this lens of the divine feminine as a critique of, call it patriarchy, call it whatever you want, but it is basically the tendencies that we have to avoid and cover up intimacy and vulnerability, and instead to become totally vulnerable in the dark, to allow ourselves to be penetrated by the darkness, to seep it up and invite it into every fiber of our embodied mind. The upshot of that will be the complete dismantling of, the highlighting of, and the opportunity to become free of all of these ways that we are blocked from loving, from being able to show up fully for others, for ourselves, for others, for the natural world, and for society, for the world in that greater sense. So there's a very direct translation, especially in terms of the benefits here, the fruit of darkness practice, when we can kind of talk about it in those terms, and really notice how these tendencies for domination, for power, for rationality especially, have inscribed themselves into the tissues of our body. Instrumental rationality, this idea of acting upon, figuring out, all of that, that runs through so much of our preoccupations with what is successful, what is the sign of, a child growing and learning in the right way, of an adult achieving, success in their vocation. Most of it in these times boils down to success in instrumental rationality, the capacity to have this conceptual way of being that is totally disembodied, that would be cut through in a second by the divine feminine, and especially the wrathful feminine, that is basically purged by the space of the dark. Doesn't matter there. It has no purchase, has no authority. The rational mind goes out the window. It's not anti-intellectual, but this kind of allegiance to an authority of the rational mind, which is, again, inherently disembodied, in that context, has no place to go. And the result of that is actually a relief, a freedom, and in its place, a view of the sacred. And whether we want to approach that as the sacred feminine or sacred in any other way, it is that place that is non-conceptual, that is wisdom, that is the bodies, the kayas of the Buddhas. It is full fruition. And so that's where we're headed. That's what we're looking at, what we're looking to explore, familiarize ourselves with, and be able to tolerate, in a sense, to be able to hold and share. So I think that's good enough for now. Hopefully that, for those of you who missed the last class, that should give you a pretty complete overview. Those of you who were there in the last class and are watching this, thank you for that extra time, and hopefully there was some new details that came out of that. And also for anyone who is interested in joining the course, who's seeing this now or future courses, hopefully that was inspiring for you. Gives you a sense of the approach, and really look forward to working with all of you and exploring the dark together. Thanks.